Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Charleston Festival, our second event this afternoon. Before I introduce today's speakers, there are a couple of things. There's one thing I just need to mention, which is a small housekeeping announcement. Could you please just take a moment to note the location of the fire exits within the marquee? In the very unlikely event that we need to evacuate, that sounds a bit dodgy, doesn't it? Please follow the instructions of Charleston staff, who will direct you to a safe assembly point. I think you can be sure I did not write that. Now, I've stood on this platform many times attempting to forge a link between the Bloomsbury group and our festival speakers. Today, it's not really so easy. Despite a keenness for Wagner and Strauss, Virginia Woolf was snubbed by more musically literate friends for her musical ignorance. Essentially, I'm sorry to say, Bloomsbury were amateurs when it came to music. Which is why perhaps they would actually have particularly appreciated the approach of Howard Goodall, whose recent BBC Two... There's a point behind this. Whose recent BBC Two series, for anyone who's seen it, The Story of Music, and the book he's written based on it, may be the reason that many of you two are here today. I'm certainly one of those. Howard says that his intention in the series was to start again from scratch, as if I were asked to explain our world of music to a visiting Martian. My aim, he says, is to make music's incredible story accessible to all music lovers and to dispense with its often unhelpful, archaic jargon. Howard, you are welcome to treat me and my ancestors as Martians. I think if I was to try to list all his credentials, he wouldn't have any time left to speak, so I'm now going to just give the edited version. Howard Goodall is a hugely successful composer himself, of musicals and of choral music. He wrote the music for Blackadder, and he's Classic FM's composer-in-residence. His latest work, More Tomorrows, premiered recently at the Albert Hall in aid of cancer research. He's got a CBE. He's won Brits, BAFTAs, and Emmys, or Emmy. He's a brilliant communicator on television and radio, and as we're about to hear here at the Charleston Festival. Joining him on the platform is the broadcaster Katie Derham, presenter of Radio 3's Afternoon on 3. She's also presented the Proms for BBC Television, hosted the Classical Brit Awards ceremony 4 times, appeared in BBC Two's talent programme Maestro, and throughout all this continues to play the violin and the piano. Howard Goodall and Katie Derham, over to you.
Well, Howard, it is a pleasure to have the opportunity to pick your brains about music. I've wanted to do so for years and years, and although our paths should have crossed at Classic FM, they never quite did. I'm not quite sure how we managed to not meet there in those...
I think you might have been leaving as I was arriving.
The two events weren't connected, I promise. Now, we just heard that, as you said, you wanted to explain music in your new book and in the television series as if we were Martians and we didn't quite understand what it was all about. I mean, did you feel very strongly that there was a need to really try and pull everything together, and that musical information and education, if you like, was a bit opaque?
Well, I'd made TV programmes before about the history and theory of music in sort of blobs. So I'd looked at a particular subject, whether it be the invention and influence of the piano, or at notation, or at the choral music, or various things dotted around over history. And one of my colleagues, the colleague who I've worked with as a producer all these years, said to me, you really ought to try and bring them all together into one long line. I said, well, that's so difficult to do because the span we're talking about is enormous. And if you're talking about all genres, that makes it even more enormous. And had we tried to include all the world's musical cultures, that would have made it even more enormous. And I'll let you into a secret. I did actually want the programme to be 10 programmes long, the series, because I thought it was so much to fit in. In the end, I was chipped down to 6. And although it was possible perhaps to do an overview of 1650 to 1750 in 1 hour, by the time you get to the 20th century, the explosion of genres and styles and the opening of the musical door to millions of new people to participate in music meant that was a very difficult thing to do. But I did think it was worth having a go at trying to tell this story in one long line. Not because music started bad and ended up good or anything simple like that, but because there seemed to me to be one basic thing that kept happening, which was that when a new invention came along, or a new idea, a new way of doing a chord, or a new structure was thought of by somebody or stumbled upon by somebody, that invention or technique stayed in the DNA of music. Once it had arrived, it kept being used in different ways by other composers and other styles thereafter. And I thought what I would try and do is plot the story through the things that change. So that if something new came along that hadn't been tried before, I'd plot that, try and explain what it was, and then it would get embedded into the overall palette that people had at their disposal. And I suppose some people, I know from my inbox that some people say, well, why wasn't there more about this composer, or more about this and more about that? And one of the reasons is that a lot of the music we love is beautiful and beautifully crafted and gives us goosebumps and makes us feel great emotion, but it may not be one of those things that changed anything. And my rule was to try and bring all this vast area of music into just 6 hours on television. The book does more, but to try and bring it down, my aim was really to look at the things that changed, which meant that some composers became more talked about than others. And I was interested to see that. And then when I started I was trained as a chorister and I read music at university myself. When I studied music, I must say I reflected upon the idea that it was more complicated than it needed to be a lot of the time. And when I came to this project and started to read up and do research, and I do all my own research because I think it's very difficult to convince the public that something's interesting or worth knowing about unless you feel it yourself. So I did about 2 years research into this. When I started looking into it, I thought so much of the problem we have talking about music is to do with terminology and ideas that are actually not the music. And I thought, might it be possible to tell this story in a clear way without getting too bogged down in the terminology? I'm going to give you a few very small examples. An octave, although it's based on the Latin word 8, is not 8 notes. A concerto grosso, now what would you guess that was? A big concerto? It's actually a small concerto. Alto is the lowest female voice. It means high. You can go on a lot of these things are not helpful to the way music's discussed, and I thought it might be possible to find a way through this, to see things as they arrive on the scene, to talk about them, and to see them get embedded into music's story, and then to follow it through to the present day. And one of the things I started to find very fascinating when I looked into it was the way that a technique changed over time. So someone would come up with a way of doing a progression between 2 or 3 chords that was particularly worked very well for them. This might be in 1700. And that you would see that same progression used time and time again in different ways. It might come back in a pop song in the 1960s. And I thought, well, isn't that fascinating? These things ebb and flow. And it's not just to do with fashion in terms of people listening to music. It's also to do with composers at different times fixing on different ways of structuring music and picking on things from the past usually and saying, oh, well, that was an interesting idea. Why don't I go back to that idea and reinvent it in the current time? And I kept seeing this happen time and time again. When you think of the style of minimalism, which is very much part of the music you hear now, modern classical music and film music, minimalism, which developed in the late 1960s and 70s in America, in fact, what those composers were doing, what they thought, they were reaching much further back for inspiration. For the structure, they thought they were going way back to a musical style from way, way before. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the composer Arvo Pärt. He's an Estonian composer who's still alive today. His music, he was inspired by 13th and 14th century music to write new music. So it was really, this is a terribly long answer to your question. Really what my plan was to see change, plot it as it came on the scene, and to try and follow that through. And I fully accept all blame for the composers I had to leave out on the way, because squeezing it down into 6 one-hour programs is a very, very difficult thing to do, particularly in the 20th century. As I say, there's a bit more detail in the book. I was managed to cover a few more people. I'll stop talking now.
No. You talking is why we're all here. It's all fine. When you say that, it's the fascinating sort of repetition and the pillaging, if you like, of old music in new music, it almost leads one to think, is there anything new that anybody could discover in music? I mean, do you sometimes think, well, where's the next big change going to come from?
Well, I don't think... There's a very good, very beautiful musical by Stephen Sondheim called Sunday in the Park with George. And in Sunday in the Park with George, an older artistic person is giving advice to a younger artistic person. And Sunday in the Park with George premiered in the... There is a point to this, by the way, to this anecdote. It premiered in the United States in the early 80s. Late 80s. And I went to see it on Broadway. And at the time, I was having a bit of difficulty with my own composing. I was sort of struggling with a piece. And in that piece, there's this song called Move On. And the older artist is saying to the younger artist, stop worrying if your vision is new. Let others make that decision. They usually do. And it's a very good piece. It's a very good piece of advice, because it's always new because it's come from a new person. And one of the little tests I used to do when I had some students, composing students, was I would say to them, each one of them, I'd say, well, you go away. Your task is to go and write a piece in the style of Elgar. Your task is to go away and write a piece like ABBA. Your task is to go away and write a piece in the style of Palestrina. Now, they were talented enough, and they went away and came back with their pastiches, which is what they were. What's really interesting about pastiche is that these, say, half a dozen students didn't, in fact, do pastiche very well, because it's almost impossible to stop yourself coming into that work. And as a slightly grumpy teacher, I would look at them and say, well, he wouldn't have written that chord, would he? And I would show, I hope in a nice, constructive, friendly way, why it didn't sound quite like the composers they'd chosen. But actually, it was a good demonstration of this fact, which is that it's really difficult to sound like someone else, really sound like someone else, because your own personality, your own preferences, the chords you like, keep slipping in there. It's impossible to stop that. And what we find time and time again in music is that composers who think they're adopting a technique or a style from before, they think they're copying, and in fact they're not, because too much of them comes forward. There was a movement. One of my pet hate terminologies in all music is the word classical, because it's wrong on so many levels. One of the reasons there was a classical... The word classical we used to talk about, really talking about ancient classical world, Rome and Greece, etc., and those buildings and whatnot. So when, at the end of the 18th century, artists and architects started to copy those buildings in their architecture, that became known as the classical period in music as well as in architecture and these things. But it doesn't really work for music, because they didn't have Roman and Greek music to go back and copy. They weren't copying anything. In fact, the style they were doing, which technically is called the style galant, was actually a new style. It was a modern style, which was a reaction to the music of their fathers and grandfathers and uncles, represented by Bach and Handel and Vivaldi. So they were doing something that was nothing to do with ancient Greece and Rome, and yet it got labelled as classical music. It's not a classical period at all. It's for music. And then, a bit later on, when you get to the 20th century, classical music comes not to just mean the music of Haydn, Beethoven and Mozart, but all music that isn't popular music, which is a second confusion. The third confusion is the point I'm just coming to, which is that in the 1920s and early 30s, some European classical composers started to imitate the music of the period of Haydn and Mozart, and it was called the neoclassical period. But again, a lot of them were imitating Baroque music, which is from 100 years before the classical period, so that wasn't neoclassical either. And if you were going to call anything neoclassical, it should have probably have been the Mozart stuff in the first place. So it's a terrible term. It's unhelpful in every respect. However, when you listen to the music that Prokofiev and Stravinsky and one or two others at that time in the 20s and 30s, what they were trying to do was they had stumbled in modernity. Modernity had got off to a good start at the beginning of the 20th century. Lots of new ideas and sounds and dissonances came available to composers, and those names I've mentioned are just one or two of a host of composers who really were trying to make new sounds. And then it seemed as if after the First World War they stalled somehow, that modernity, they were really having difficulty with it. So they kind of put the brakes on and reversed at high speed and went back to this music of the period of Mozart and Haydn and before that Bach, etc. And said, what if we were to sort of rewrite that style? This is what is called in technical musical terms neoclassicism, this period of about 15 years when these composers did it. But what's fascinating is that Stravinsky, for example, he took this 18th century music out of an old library and he sort of rammed it back together again for a ballet, Pulcinella. But the strange thing is, he thinks he's playing around with these Italian composers of a different period. In fact, it sounds like Stravinsky. So even he, when he's trying to sound old, he can't let the Aladdin comes out of the lamp, whether you like it or not. And I love the fact that it doesn't make the more recent composers' attempts better or worse. It just means that the well of ideas and creativity is a living one, and it goes on being a living one. And it's notoriously difficult and bad idea to try and guess what will happen in the future. But I have absolutely no doubt at all that one of the ways that the general mainstream of music will be enriched is by people going backwards and looking at something and looking at it in a different way, looking in a different light.
I just think it's fascinating to think that if we were to be talking sort of rather decrepit, I'm sure, in 50 years' time, if we'd be looking back and saying, well, of course, 2030, that's when they discovered a whole new harmony. Because, I mean, some of the in the first half of the book particularly, the revolutions you discuss, I mean, they are earth-shattering musically, aren't they? It's the discovery, as I say, of the idea of putting two lines of music together and creating harmony, then creating a chord. I mean, they aren't just stylistic, they are very fundamental, aren't they?
Yeah, someone once asked me whether harmony had always existed, and it's just that in a Western Eurocentric way, we stumbled upon it at a certain point, and that therefore we think it's important that in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries they did this. But what's interesting about that question is that it really is a staggering thought that for hundreds of centuries it never occurred to anybody that this was an option. It seems so normal to us, the idea of more than one note at the same time. But the reason we know this is kind of the case is that in other cultures, that idea continued. And that, in fact, although now, for example, Indian classical music has harmony in it, and there has overlaid lines, in fact, it's a relatively recent thing, which is, to a large extent, imported in from the Western sound palette. And when Indian musicians are playing, they're actually thinking in a different way about the layout of the music, about the stratum that it's made up of, because they're thinking of a rhythmic line which has some notes in it. The tablas have notes in their tuning. And they're thinking of a melody line which is often very complex and moving around. But they never would have thought, well, this is going to be enhanced by having further notes in the mix. And they didn't need harmony because they already had a very full sound. It was filled, the air, if you like, that filled up the music was filled with rhythm and rhythmic complexity and layers of a different kind. Likewise, we think in the West that notation of music seems like an obvious thing to want to do, to be able to write a piece of music down, therefore you can pass it to another person, they can reinterpret it, the composer and the player don't have to be the same person, etc., etc. It's an unusual fact that only Western music developed a notation. And it's not because in Indonesian music or Chinese music they weren't capable of doing that. They would have been capable. It's just that it wouldn't have occurred to them, why would you need to write it down? Because for them, music lives in the moment. Yeah. It's passed on, father to son, mother to daughter. The songs are passed on, and it's in the doing of it that it gets created. So the very basic templates are then improvised upon and embellished. And it would have surprised an Indian classical musician in 1900. Why would you want to make it so that this piece is always the same after this moment? It isn't music alive and changing all the time. So it's this. One of the things it struck me doing this survey was how many of the things we take totally for granted are actually, it was possible to have music without these things for quite a long time. And what's also quite funny is that they put two notes together, two lines together. It took them hundreds of years to move to three, and then four. Wouldn't you think, once you put two together, I wonder what three sounds like? But no.
Or that you just discover it by accident. You know, you've got a church, an abbey choir with talented singers and musicians, that somebody might have just got something wrong and thought, actually, that sounds okay.
Well, actually, I think there is some... I didn't explore this very far in either my book or my program, but it's quite an interesting idea that the idea of overlaying more than one line together in singing in religious music comes about around the same time as these vast European Gothic cathedrals are being built. And it has been put, not by me, other people have suggested, that perhaps it was experiencing the sounds bouncing back, overlapping on themselves in these buildings with these extraordinary reverberations and sounds coming from over here that may have occurred to them. Well, that sounds quite nice, that accidental creation of lines overlapping. That sounded beautiful and strange and mysterious. But again, even though something sounded lovely, you wouldn't necessarily think, well, I'm going to artificially do that now on a piece of paper. What you might think is, let's go on singing like this and get this lovely effect in this building, because it sounds nice. Why is not broke, let's not fix it. But somebody had the idea, or several people perhaps at the same time had the idea, why don't we formalise these overlapping lines? We don't, of course, really know, because on the whole, people didn't say, I had a great idea today. I put three lines together instead of four, because it emerged very slowly over a period of time. And it was a delightful thing for me, because one of the ways I put these programs together is that I work out roughly what the story I want to tell is, and then I go and look at the music along the way. And the only way I really know to understand this music is to sit down with it on my own and just work out what's going on in this music, what's making it tick. And one of the things I stumbled upon, because I think I'd done this guy at university, and it must have been a bad day, because there's this composer Peritin, worked in Notre Dame in the early 14th century. Do I mean, yes. I must have studied him briefly at university, but it's sort of gone out of my mind. And when I sat down with this Peritin music, which is the first music really that we have left, written in four lines, sort of chords really, vocal chords made up together. I looked at it and I thought, he was either completely mad, or the modern ear is looking at this and thinking, this sounds much more like the music we're familiar with than what must have been the case then. Because if you listen to everything else that was going on at that time, nothing like this chap's music. He really did something completely different with these four lines. He was creating chords no one had ever heard before, willfully. It's like he's saying, here's another one, here's another one, here's another one. And the sense of adventure and experiment and eccentricity in this music that has survived is very extraordinary when you're experiencing, looking at the score or listening to it on a recording. And you think, what must have happened is he started to do this, and because Paris was an important European place at the time, lots of people came in and out of Paris, other people must have come along and said, what is that guy doing? And wanted to go and imitate it. And that has happened all the way around the world. And there was a great story told by, this is a strange comparison this may sound like, but Brian Wilson of the Bee Gees tells a great story about how he was working with his Beach Boys. Was working in LA with his fellow group members on a new album which they thought was going to be very cutting edge. And they'd been working on it for months. And someone arrived in the studio with an acetate, which is the old, when you used to make records, vinyl records, and you were working in the studio, which was on magnetic tape, they would make test pressings of just one or two or three vinyl. It wasn't vinyl, it was an acetate. Test pressings with just one machine so that it could be put on a record player and listened to if you didn't have a tape recorder, etc. They used to make these test pressings, and there'll be just a few on each recording. They're very expensive and difficult to make, so it generally stayed with the people who were making the record. Anyway, Brian Wilson tells a story about how someone arrived in the studio late at night with an acetate of Sergeant Pepper, which was still being worked on in the studio in London. No one had heard it. And he very graciously tells this story. He said, we stopped our work, we put this acetate on and listened through to Sergeant Pepper and ditched their entire album.
Yeah.
Because they realised what was going on this album was so extraordinary and so full and so different and so rich. However, of course, after months, years go by, they then start working back, their own creativity and ingenuity starts to kick back in. And most groups around that time would have responded one way or another to the changes that took place in Sgt. Pepper. So in a way, it's a great thing that these strange little things happen, but then all the other musicians are listening and say, how's he doing that? What's going on there? And I'm guilty of it myself. I hear something, I think it's quirky or different, or they're using some instrument in an unusual way. I will try and find out how they're doing it and what they're doing it. And there's a lot of chit-chat amongst composers and musicians who work in the big studios in London doing films and whatnot. Will often say to somebody, how did they get that sound on that? And there'll be someone who'll give the game away. The engineer or a fellow musician will come in and say, oh no, he didn't do it like that at all. He got this violin, he turned it upside down. There'll be some funny technique. You can't keep the new ideas quiet for long. But I think that process has gone on right the way through history, is these new innovations come along, everybody picks up, I'd like to have a go at that.
Your mention of engineers and the technology, though, does bring me happily to the next thing I wanted to talk to you about, because, of course, it's so much easier to hear innovation and change now. And so much of what was fascinating, and I found in your book, was this whole idea that, of course, people didn't hear their favourite pieces of music very often in their life, because there was no way, unless you were lucky enough to be in a court with court musicians or in a very wealthy environment or in a church. That's the only place. Those are the only places you can hear music.
Yes, and of course, in non-Western musical systems, you had music near you all the time because local musicians would play. But in the Western setup, these new large-scale pieces had been created for larger numbers of musicians, specialist musicians, who were concentrated in certain cities. And if you wanted to hear that, you had to be there or you were never going to hear it. And there's a fascinating thought that when Monteverdi composed his first opera, Orfeo, this is 1607, opera there'd only been about 3 operas written before this, ever. Because opera, unlike everything else in music, was actually invented by a committee of people called the Florentine Camerata, who were a group of intellectuals and musicians and poets who said, why can't we create a form of musical drama where the story is told through singing and art and design and dance?
Sounds like the BBC.
Yeah. And they actually set out to write this very thing that they had invented, which hadn't existed before. And 2 or 3 of their members put on these prototype operas, which were heard by only a few people because they were put on as entertainments at royal weddings for the nobility. So normal people didn't even know anyone had even had the idea. And one of the guests at one of these royal weddings in Florence was Monteverdi's employer, the Duke of Mantua, who got home from the wedding and said to his composer-in-residence, Monteverdi, could you write me one of these new forms of opera? Monteverdi himself had never seen an opera, never heard of an opera. He wouldn't have known this committee discussions. Duke of Mantua says to him, this is what happens. You tell a story, you do it all with songs. He gave him the outline. So Monteverdi writes this opera, which is the first good opera. It's not the first opera, but it's certainly the first good one, and it's survived to the present day miraculously. He writes this piece, not having seen the form before, and the first performance was performed to a room, if you imagine just that little section of the audience there, a room that size, to an audience smaller than that group of people there. I think probably on maybe 1 or 2 nights. It's a very small number of people in a big, in the Duke of Mantua's residence. His son, his friends, just a few people. This is the amazing thing. It might have just stayed opera as a noble in-house entertainment, but it clearly created some kind of reverberation because the following year he did another opera for the Duke of Mantua, Arianna, of which only 1 aria has survived. The rest of it's all been lost to history. But when they put that piece on, they did it in an open-air arena inside the court, which I went to visit when I was making a film about this. and 5,000 people a night saw it for a whole week. So in just 1 year, this new form had gone from being just a few people in a room to something that the whole town of Mantua could enjoy and be amazed by. And that's... I can't remember what the question was.
No, we were talking about how you didn't have access to music in the same way.
Access, yes. And those people who saw that piece, Ariana, saw it that night, their chosen night they were in, and never again in their whole lives, once. And only really the 19th century, when people could reproduce things by playing them in their home pianos, would you start to hear music on a regular basis, and in pubs and taverns and music halls, etc. But to hear a symphony orchestra play a piece of music, you might only hear that 2 or 3 times in your life.
That exciting thing that if you were lucky enough to go to a symphonic concert in the 19th century, you would expect to hear new music, wouldn't you? You wouldn't expect to hear an old favourite. You'd think, well, I might get something I've not heard before, but the chances are it'll be brand new.
Yes, I mean, it's a strange thought for us today that when, I think it's Beethoven's 7th and 8th symphonies, or its 6th and 7th, were premiered in the same concert.
Yeah. And other pieces as well, I think. Yeah.
First of all, length. But I suppose in a way it was a bit like watching an evening's telly. You'd settle in 6 o'clock and the concert would go on till about 11:30 when it's time to go to bed.
Out, cup of tea.
So loads of music. But that's the extraordinary thing. You look at concert programmes from the 19th century when concert going became something that certainly the middle classes did, and increasingly a wider group of people. It's new music. It's all new pieces. They did not expect to hear old pieces by Bach and Handel. Occasionally one or two would pop up. And the Messiah was performed right the way through the 19th century in England. But generally speaking, old music had been and gone. And this love of old music is a 20th century phenomenon which came about because of recording.
And when you look at concert programmes now, my goodness, you do not often see much new music. You certainly wouldn't assume you were going to see new music. It's almost a very niche.
Well, yes, although I think...
appeal, isn't it?
I think it's very important I have to keep telling myself to do this, because we've got to use the word music very carefully here, because we've never lived at a time when there was more new music in all fields. And a young person might expect to go and hear new music played in a club or a bar,
yes.
All the time. Absolutely, and they're hearing new releases every day, of which there are thousands every week. In classical music terms, even there's quite a lot of new music, but the difficulty is getting past the first performance, because quite a lot of new music is commissioned and performed once, and then it's getting that sense of the thing having a momentum and moving on to the second and third and fourth performance, so it starts to become part of a repertoire that orchestras do. That's the really difficult bit. And what definitely happened in the 20th century was that this vast archive of old music that was all recorded gradually, decade by decade, began to, I think, overwhelm new music that was arriving in the classical genre, because very, very difficult for a young composer in 1950 or 60 or 70 or 80 to compete with 30 new releases that week of beautiful music that had been written 300 years earlier, which had not been recorded or had been lost. And some of these things are amazing. Vivaldi was unknown until the 1930s, possibly a little bit earlier for some people. I mean, things that we now think are completely ubiquitous, the seasons, unknown. And his music was discovered in an attic, well, not an attic, in some room in a library in a monastery in Italy, and suddenly spread across Europe in the mid-20th century. So I don't blame, in a way, I don't blame classical composers of new music in the 20th century for being confused, because they were being assaulted on all sides. Their competition became very, very extreme.
This is true. However, there are some contemporary classical composers like you who have managed to get through that barrier, and whose recordings and whose live performances are very popular and seen by lots and lots of people and heard by many, many people. But there does seem to have been this split, if you like, in the 20th century with contemporary classical composers, almost a snobbery that it has to be difficult and avant-garde and tricky, and the audiences don't necessarily warm to it. And yet there is, I personally, and this is just my opinion.
That's a new piece being
yes,
premiered.
Exactly. Well done. You heard it here first.
Percussion concerto.
Do you feel there's a bit of a bit of nonsense, frankly, in the composing world between those who are popular and those who are not?
I think, obviously, as a composer in my kind of world, writing for film and TV and also classical concert works, I probably get my fair share of down-the-nose comments. But the thing is, it's difficult on this because I think, in a way, there is a sense that I certainly found a little bit of this doing the series in the book, is that there was definitely a movement in 20th century music amongst classically trained composers where they were pushing the boundaries that happened in all arts. And it's a completely legitimate thing to be doing.
Of course, indeed, and to be praised in many ways and
quite.
encouraged.
An experiment is a good thing. But I think one of the odd things that happened was that a lot of the experiment, which was very, pretty cutting edge and difficult for ordinary audiences to identify with, was taking place in public, whereas a lot of experimentation is better off being done in a small room with a small number of people finding out what works, rather than making 1,000 people sit through, what is a tennis ball like as a piece of as a musical instrument. You can't, by the way, make up examples of avant-garde experiments that are more extraordinary than the ones that actually happened and that people had to sit through. But there was definitely a feeling amongst a sort of avant-garde clique in various Western countries in the 40s, 50s and 60s that if people enjoyed it, it was somehow not good enough, or it would make it trashy, or that it had to be as difficult as possible for people to enjoy. Now, that didn't do them any favours, and it certainly didn't do classical music any favours, because there was definitely a period, I think we're coming out of it, I'm glad to say, definitely a period where people became very fearful of going to hear new music, because on the whole, it was going to be something that was going to be difficult for them to enjoy. And I think that's true, and I think there was a certain amount of, well, if you were writing film music, or if you were writing something that people might have a tune, that you were somehow letting the side down, or as a betrayal of true values. But there's another side to this which does touch a nerve with me, which is that there's a little bit that going on in this the kind of cliquey world we're talking about, which was very prevalent when I was growing up as a young musician, 50s, 60s, and 70s. I wasn't growing up in the 50s, but in that period when I was a chorister and I was a young composer, there was a feeling that it was if it was complicated and you didn't get it, it was your fault that you weren't clever enough or bright enough or switched on enough to get it. It was your fault, not theirs. And the reason why it touches the nerve with me is because I'm pretty well educated in music. I got a first at Oxford in music. I do know my stuff, and I can't have the wool pulled over my eyes very easily. And if someone says to me, you just don't get it, or if I don't get it, I think probably that's most people don't get it. And I don't really buy this idea that there's a level somewhere out there that's so clever, so magnificent, that a mere mortal like me with a music degree simply can't get there to Mount Parnassus. I'm very suspicious of that. And that's why I take this view that I think that, but you have to look at this. The other side of that same coin is that all through the 20th century, there were lots of new pieces being written that did find favour with an audience, that did eventually get accepted. And in my book and in my TV series, I do tackle this issue of the particular issue of serialism, which was a technique developed by Schoenberg and followed by his pupils, Alban Berg and Anton Webern, at the beginning of the 20th century. And it was a form of modernism. There were lots of different forms of modernism going on, lots of experiment going on. But this one experiment is unique in music history in one respect, which is most other really new things that are challenging and sharp on the ear or difficult to listen to, the first few times, cause a sort of frisson of panic, fear, something. And, for example, Stravinsky's Rite of Spring premiered 100 years ago in Paris. Some people in the audience were very shocked by it, others were quite excited by it. It did create a kind of frisson of anxiety for some people because it was a sound they hadn't heard before. All through history, those modern pieces have existed, and all through history, they've been reacted to by some people with shock and horror, and others, well, give it a few more times. But after about 40 or 50 years, lots of these pieces have gone into the repertoire and been accepted, and now we listen to them. How was it possible for anybody to be shocked by Beethoven's Seventh Symphony? We got used to those sounds, and even now listen to the Rite of Spring, which was sort of high watermark of early 20th century modernism. Now most people listen to it don't think they're going to have nightmares. You think that's a rather lovely sound.
I did hide behind the curtains when I heard that the first time. I was 6.
So all this process of something new and challenging, which needs 30 or 40 years for it to be accepted. There's one exception to this, which is the technique of serialism, which has been around for over 100 years and still is not accepted by a mainstream audience. There are people who love it, and there are people who enjoy it enormously, no doubt about it. But it has not moved, this particular technique of serialism, not even the whole music of Schoenberg, because Schoenberg wrote lots of music that wasn't serial, which people love and it's very beautiful. But the particular technique that composers started to use has still, in the 21st century, still not had that lag that all other forms of modernism have had. It still resists the ear for some reason that probably it's a longer analysis than we can do here. But I pointed this fact out because it is a fact. It's a fact that it's largely responsible for lots of composers writing music that in the mid to late 20th century scared audiences, not because it was frightening music, but because it was so unpleasant and ugly to listen to. And
yes, it was almost more a mathematical exercise, wasn't it?
Yes, and it was a mathematical formula applied to music. Now, it's perfectly good idea to try and experiment. It's a perfectly good idea to try a new formula, especially if music's been around a long time. Let's mix things up a bit. But if you had developed a formula that simply resisted being accepted, after a bit you might begin to think there might be something about the formula, and you might try a different formula. So it's just that particular experiment, I think it's unique in music history. It has still never really found its place in the general audience's mind. Yes, amongst some aficionados, yes, but generally the mainstream audience. And now, as a chronicler, I have to point that out. It's not because I think serialism is bad, someone else is good. It's just that, as a matter of fact, that's what's happened. And I think some people who are very keen on the possibilities of serialism were provoked by my statement of that. And I really feel that this is just what's happened. And I'm not saying it might have worked another way if things had gone a different way. But it's an unusual little cul-de-sac in music's history because whilst most classical composers were experimenting with serialism in the 40s and 50s and early 60s, now almost none do. So even the composers themselves have moved away from it back to other techniques.
You mentioned earlier you feel that the state of contemporary classical music is in a good, an optimistic place now, and it's moved away from that feeling of having to challenge and having to be scary. How do you see the current state of particularly live musical performance? Do you feel that we're healthy?
Well, I think that it has, to be fair, it's important not to label all music with everybody, if you see what I mean, because, first of all, it's perfectly all right for there to be some music that some people like and other people don't like it, whatever it is. It's possible for there to be composers who some people absolutely love and other people can't get their heads around it at all. Having said that, in the great sort of mass of sound that we're all open to all the time, there probably is an emphasis these days on things that are short, 3 to 4 minutes, 5 minutes, and that it's very hard for people to have the patience to sit with a new piece that's maybe 30 minutes or 50 or even longer. And that patience is something that's affected all art forms and all forms of discourse. It's something particular to music. It just happens to be something that's also happened in music. And I think because of that, some composers, were they sitting here, would say it's very hard to get audiences to be patient and sit through longer pieces with bigger architecture that might need 2 or 3 listens for you to fall in love with, unlike something that you might hear that's 3 minutes long and instantly get to like. And I can see that's a challenge. But I think we're sometimes a bit hard on ourselves because when you hear people doom and gloom about the state of live music, classical music, in the 19th century there weren't 6 or 7 professional symphony orchestras in London. The sheer volume number of choirs, the number of people participating in music is of a scale that's never happened anywhere in any place. And that's true in many countries of the world. What we are expecting more of ourselves all the time, that if all this music is there, why doesn't everybody know it all? That's an expectation that we've placed on ourselves because it's all out there, it's all available. And the wealth of things you can hear on the radio or that you can find on the internet or that you can download, I mean, it's just a staggering amount. And we should be saying, well, that means we're very musical modern people, rather than panicking that somehow that means we're going to lose all this culture. I don't think we are, really. I think one issue I would flag up as being probably something that might be in the future become more problematical is that what we have now, which we didn't really have 200 years ago, is big institutions with buildings and salaries and support staff and all that kind of stuff. We want that because we want the high standards that brings about. So whether it's opera houses or big symphony orchestras and new concert halls. But those things don't actually, they're not actually the music itself. And the structures of all those things are quite new things. In the old days, you could sort of make music simpler, in a simpler way, with you get together, make music in a live environment. And the environment didn't matter quite so much. But what we've got now, these big structures and big setups. And an example of what I'm talking about is this. Symphony orchestras exist, and they have roughly 100 players, and they're laid out with X number of violins, violas, cellos, basses, woodwind, brass, percussion. If we hadn't inherited the symphony orchestra like that in the 20th century, not many 20th century composers after about 1950 would have chosen that constellation of 100 players. We write for those groups because they're there and they exist and they commission pieces. But if you asked John Adams or Philip Glass or James Macmillan or any of the composers who worked in the last 40, 50 years, if they didn't know that the symphony orchestra, what instruments would you choose? They wouldn't probably. I asked John Adams this very same question because I've suspected this is the case. Did say, what would you choose as a symphony orchestra now? That particular layout, 30 violins, etc. Of course he wouldn't, because new sounds have become available, new combinations of sounds have become available, and composers are exploring different groupings of players. But the symphony orchestra persists because it's playing all that 19th century repertoire, and they're there, so they commission 20th century and 21st century composers. But if things had been allowed to develop of their own volition, I suspect the ensembles would have changed, and what they're made up of would have changed. And you can see this from the names of the pieces, things for 6 marimbas or percussion and no brass. I mean, they are trying to move around the building blocks quite a lot, and I think that that's changing. And now that you can go into the studio and do a film score with any combination of any instruments you like, of course that's, again, changing.
What would your perfect ensemble be?
Well, I still like the big orchestra, but I tend to write more for strings and brass. And I must confess, I don't use the woodwind as much as other composers do. And like a lot of composers of this period, I have a much bigger interest in percussion and rhythm than my 19th century predecessors would have done. In a 19th century orchestra, even a big one would have had a couple of percussion players busy. Whereas once you get to the late 20th century, 21st century, there's many, you probably noticed when you go to concert, there's many more percussionists doing much more with much more kit. Yeah. And now, of course, we're mixing electronic instruments and newer instruments coming along with the old-fashioned sounds. And in film music, really, that's where the biggest experiment in terms of sound is taking place, where composers are mixing all sorts of combinations of instruments, together in a way that wasn't possible before, because you could just bring in anybody. I want 2 marimba players, come over here. Accordion, come over here. And you can bring them into the studio and put all these sounds together one by one. My wife and I bumped into John Lunn the other night at an opening of a new drama on TV, for which he's done the music. And he's the chap who wrote the music for Downton Abbey. And we were chatting away about the recording. Because of co-production deals, he's recorded it in Brussels, with an orchestra in Brussels. And he said, I was given a very small budget for the orchestra. So what I did was I just had cellos and violins. Got rid of everybody else. And no violas. And he said, because you can get
They're
the cello.
They're always the butt of every joke,
I know, poor chap. Yeah. But it was quite an interesting angle. I'd never thought to do that. He just said, well, actually, you get a slightly different sound palette from that. It's a way of getting a big sound from the strings without actually having many more players. And those kind of experiments with combinations are going on all the time in the recorded sector.
Now, you write for all sorts of different genres of music. I mean, as we've already heard Blackadder, as well as orchestral pieces, just recently premiered at the Albert Hall. And I heard just before that you're now writing a musical of Bend It Like Beckham.
I am, yes.
Now, tell us about that. That sounds fantastic.
Or as I tweeted yesterday, End It Like Beckham.
Yes, well, you see...
Which I saw on the front page of the Times this morning.
Always a news hound.
I did get that gag out. Yes, I shouldn't really be talking about it too much. It's still work in progress. But it's a very interesting project for me because if you are going to ask me what musical styles, what's going to happen to musical style in the next 50 years, I would say that what we've learned in the last 150 years is that great collisions of different types of musical styles from different parts of the world have been a very big component of the music we've been listening to in the last 100 years, particularly, as African music collided with Western and got mixed up, etc. And I would say that the next massive coming together of music, which has already started, is Western and Indian music, which has got a lot of overlap, as well as lots of things that aren't overlapped. And I think there's a huge exchange going on in that. In fact, the worldwide phenomenon of Bhangra, which is a mix between mainly Punjabi folk music and Western pop music, came about in Britain. It's now a massive worldwide phenomenon, but it started here in London and Birmingham as Indian and Western musicians started to mix their music together. And I think that's a small sign of another big movement that's going to sweep through world music in the next 20, 30 years. And it's very interesting for me to be doing Bend It Like Beckham, because the Gurinder Chadha, who wrote the book wrote the film and directed the film, did say to me, I don't want you suddenly to sort of pretend to be an Indian. This is, Fiddler on the Roof set in Southall. And I said, don't you want an Asian composer? He said, no, what I want is you to respond to this, because this is a story about London and about communities in London living next to each other. And
but
so,
are you going to be collaborating with?
I already have been.
Yeah.
Yes, and I've been on a sort of massive
Course.
learning course about Indian music, and loving it actually, and Indian musicians, and just trying to absorb what's a bit like I was saying about analysing a piece of Perotin. I get the Indian music. Grinda keeps sending me loads of stuff, and I'm working with a wonderful Indian musician called Kujit Bamra. And they'll just send me music, listen to this, and I just analyse it. What's going on here? What's making it work? But ultimately, the piece I'm writing is me, and it's my take, as it were, on these colliding styles. And it will be for other people to decide whether I've done that successfully or not. But in a sense, I'm doing just what anybody's done, which is to listen to all this and to absorb it and bring it out. Because what we didn't want to do was write a sort of cod Indian piece. That wouldn't work on the stage either. So that's what I'm halfway through writing at the moment, and loving it, even though it's the most difficult thing I've ever done.
Really?
Yeah.
Now, I would love to carry on asking you questions, but it's not fair. Would anybody else from the floor like to ask Howard pretty much anything? I think we've got carte blanche. So, over here at the back, there's a microphone approaching fast.
Thank you. I don't know if you heard Howard Winston's first programme called The Science of Music on Tuesday. He claims that music is pre-vocal. When we talk to babies and pets, we tend to sing song more. So would you say, one, that any human being can respond to music even if they claim to be tone deaf? Secondly, do you subscribe to the long-held view that there are two kinds of music, good and bad?
Well, I think it's 2 times the population of the world, because every person's view of what's good and bad is different from the next person. So what's that? 12 billion types
14,
of music?
yes.
14, no problem. So that was the first one. The first question, pre-vocal. Well, look, I think that it was Steven Pinker, the writer, who first talked about language being something that was hardwired into us, rather than something we necessarily... It's a nature-nurture issue. And I think he said in one of his books a couple of decades ago, he said, he had lots of evidence to suggest that language was hardwired into us, and it was a natural thing for us to do. It's an instinct. But one of the byproducts of Steven Pinker's view was that he thought that therefore music, singing, was a nice add-on that came as a result of language. Now, since he said that, there's been quite a lot of discussion and work done to counter that view. And in fact, it could be that the opposite is in fact the case. And I'll give an example of this, which is that it does seem intuitive, it does seem to make sense that forms of singing may have occurred before a sophisticated form of language. And the example I give of this is this. You can speak English in a monotone and be understood. If you did the same to Chinese, you would not be understood. Pitch in Chinese is part of the understanding of the language. Going up and down, pitch recognition for a Chinese infant is as essential as all the other parts of language, syntax, verbs, etc., are for Western languages. And this makes me think that pitch recognition, pitch going up and down, is very, very deep and old and existed with us. And it's not particularly far-fetched to imagine that before we could frame words, our alarm, our anger, our soothing, our calling for someone wherever you are, all these things were expressed in pitches that didn't have a beginning, a middle and end of a word, but were pitches, and that may have been a pre-language form of usage. It also seems to make sense that calming a baby with a singing of some kind is a more fundamental skill than saying to someone, could you go out and get the asparagus? It seems more emotionally natural to us as a species for our survival, because going to get the asparagus, you could probably go and do that without having to have the discussion. But the act of singing to the child is actually something that doesn't require discussion. So I'd always go, probably, I would say that, but I would say I think probably singing is something I would say it's before speech, but we may not know that answer definitively forever. Having said that, I think that whether or not music as a whole, whether we made rhythms, whether we made more complex structures than vocalizations, we won't, it's very hard to say whether that's the case. We did. Certainly rhythms, why are most of our rhythms in the world divided by two? It's because we've got two legs, and as our legs move like this, we create a rhythm. We naturally now have a two beat. Three is a more recent thing, but most of the rhythms, this is all musical systems in the world, start with divisions by two. And in a sense, you could say that's arbitrary. Well, I don't think it is arbitrary, because our walking or our running is what we get a sense of a beat, probably from. I say probably because a lot of this is very old theory about stuff went on way before. It's very difficult to work out from bones.
Thank you, though. Any more questions? Gentleman in the red jumper over there.
You've probably been asked this question many times before, but if we put you on the desert island, it would be very difficult, I'm sure, all of us here to choose our 8 favourite. But which is the one you would take with you as your favourite?
Well, you know, I did do Desert Islandist once as a guest, and it's really difficult. But what I did was I imagined I did the same test I think most people do on that programme, which is you choose the pieces because of their emotional significance to you in your life, rather than because it's the best pieces ever written. I don't think. I mean, there are some pieces that I absolutely love. Probably wouldn't be called the best pieces ever written. But if you're asking me what were the 8 things I would choose to somehow sum up Western music, or put them in a spaceship perhaps for another civilization, I'd be hard pushed not to include some Bach on there. And I think Bach was put onto the Voyager craft that went off into space, because Bach is kind of the, I don't want to say composer's composer, because he means so much to everybody who isn't a composer. But as with Mozart, there's an ease of brilliance that is baffling, and baffling in a beautiful way. And I quite like it when I can't, because it's quite hard for me to turn off the analysis switch. So when I listen to a piece of music, I'm seeing its score in my head in front of me, and I'm working out what's going on in it. And I can't stop that happening. But it's quite nice listening to Bach, because you just know he's cleverer than you are, no matter what. And I can, in a sense, switch off and enjoy it very easily, because I'm just accepting his brilliance. The same with Mozart. You listen to Mozart, how the hell's he doing that? Because it's so often it's deceptively simple. But, you know, I'm like everybody else. I have my favourite things. My one piece I chose and took with me, the one I had to choose, was the De Rufflet Requiem, which is a very, very beautiful piece. But the main reason I chose it was, apart from it being very, very beautiful and very influential on me, because oddly enough, even though I'm very, I think my music is often identified as being quite British sounding, actually I'm very influenced by French composers, particularly when I'm writing choral music. But I chose that really because it reminds me of my wife, who's sitting over there, who also loves that piece. And when we go to our house in France and I'm composing upstairs, Val has often got the Driftley record quite loudly on in the kitchen, and I can't really hear the recording, but I can hear her singing along with it. So that's why I chose that to take my Desert Island, just because it had immense significance to me, and it's a very beautiful piece. And by the way, that links us into a point we were making at the beginning, because Driftley's Requiem, I don't know if you know, it's written in 1949, I think, or 1948. Incredibly beautiful piece of mid-20th century music, a new piece of music, but not at all scary. But what he did was he went back to the Latin plain song of each part of the Mass, and he took the plain song and he surrounded this plain song tune with his new harmonies and his new orchestrations and his new ideas. So he went right back hundreds of years and took those themes, those very simple plain songs, and built this great structure out of them. So he, like everybody else, is doing a bit of dipping and diving.
Oh, got one over there. Sorry, we'll come to you
Sorry,
next.
I feel I've physically been leaving you out a bit.
In one or two of your programs, I think you've touched on jazz music and the harmonic and technical improvements in it. No doubt influence from classical, if I may use that expression. I noticed, I think I saw it reported that Daniel Barenboim, in regard to keyboards, commented that in his opinion, the top flight of jazz musicians were as technically and musically accomplished as the top flight of classical concert artists. You might not agree with that, but it was an interesting comment. I just wondered how you saw future cross-fertilization between the two genres, given that so many classical jazz pianists now are coming out of the Royal Academy, fully qualified classical musicians.
Yes, I mean, I think I would agree with Barenboim. I think technically speaking, some of the jazz players are unbelievably technically adept. But I think it's also true to say, and you mentioned the Royal Academy of Music there, but most young musicians who are of great ability, coming up through the conservatoire or school system, whatever it may be, have a much broader attitude to music, full stop, because they've been born in a later period of time. It was possible to go to music college in the 1950s, 60s and 70s and never hear a note of anything that wasn't classical, whereas young musicians these days are likely to be enticed by not just classical music, but by a wider palette of sounds. And for a lot of the keyboard players in particular are often very excited by the technical challenges of jazz and what it can do and how it changes your mind. You know, one of the things about being a classically trained musician like myself, and a lot of people who go to conservatoire, is that you're very much a slave to the notes on the page. And what jazz teaches a lot of players is to fly away from that page, is to become free of the page and the dots. And it's a very useful thing to learn. It's very difficult, by the way. It may sound easy, but it's not. Actually leave the page behind and invent the music and understand it in your head. I think this is a very good discipline for young players, whether they're going to end up being jazz players or not. And I think they're attracted to the technical difficulties of jazz. But I would also say that I have a personal slight worry with things that are terribly, terribly difficult and are fun for players to play because they're terribly, terribly difficult, because it doesn't always end up in a nice experience for the listener. That's not to say not lots of jazz that I love. It's just that I think there is a technical, kind of slightly boffinish obsession that comes with some players because it's difficult. And I remember the late, great conductor Richard Hickox, when he was conducting a piece I'd written for a small orchestra once. He sat me down before the concert about 2 weeks before, and he looked at the score. He said, very nice, very nice. He said, mostly what you're trying to do is more difficult than it needs to be to get exactly the same effect. He said, you should be, and I was a very young composer at the time. It was very good advice, because what you're trying to do when you're young is sort of impress that you know all this stuff. Oh, I can do this. And in fact, he said, look, this phrase here, it's really difficult for these players to play, but if you did an easier version of it, exactly that, he showed me how, same result exactly to the listener, but not stupidly difficult. And the other piece of advice he gave me was, if you make something very, very difficult, all the rehearsal time is taken up with them learning this difficulty, and you waste your rehearsal time. What you really want to do the rehearsal time is creating a piece of music, and in the moment, creating something that has a shape and a feeling, which is a difficult thing to do, and you need those players in the room to do it. That's what you need to rehearse. That's the more important thing, not how am I going to get my fingers around this phrase, which is what a lot of young musicians and composers end up doing. And a lot of the stuff I get sent by young composers is phenomenally, stupidly difficult. And I think to myself, who's going to play this? All they're going to be doing is furrowing their brow, having a panic attack. And why would you put your players through that? So I think it's swings and roundabouts. One thing I just want to add to that, I had a thought yesterday, and I just wanted to add to this thing about jazz and classical music, which is that we went to see the Bowie is exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum yesterday. I actually worked on it and was the musical curator of it, and I hadn't actually seen it since we were away, so I hadn't actually seen the exhibition I worked on. We went to see it for the first time yesterday. And one of the things I'm often criticised for, and I make no apology for it, is that I dot across history and say, well, this person's doing this, and isn't it interesting, this technique's still being used 300 years later. But I actually think that's part of the interesting thing that's going on in music. And I wouldn't want to say David Bowie versus Benjamin Britten, because they're completely different, and they're doing different things. They both happen to be born in Britain, and they did music in different genres. I'm not comparing whether one's good or one's bad, but as an observation, I came out of it thinking there is no British classical composer of the 20th century who has made the global impact of David Bowie. And it's when you see the exhibition, you see his impact on the world, on so many fields of culture. It's quite a sobering thought that we've got to be a bit careful that we don't always assume that because people are incredibly well trained in classical music, that they are always going to make the biggest impact. In fact, sometimes the biggest impact comes from what I would describe in his work is a sort of ingénue enthusiasm and thirst for knowledge. In a sense, he has, to some extent, he has some of Paul McCartney's blotting paper interest in music. Much of the Beatles' discoveries are things that Paul McCartney heard, said, can we do that? He heard Bach's Second Brandenburg Concerto and said, can we have something like that in one of our pieces? And so they put together Penny Lane. It's this idea of hearing something, saying, why can't I respond to this? And David Bowie is a very good example of an artist whose ears have been open all his life, and he's just brought in all these sort of untaught, in a sense, all these influence, and it's come out in something that's had a fantastic impact around the world. I'm not saying it's good or bad impact, I'm just saying in terms of global impact, we've got very few people in our very creative and imaginative and populated country who've made that amount of impact across the world in music. And one or two people have written to me saying, why wasn't there more about British music in your programme? Actually, I thought it did quite a bit on British music, but the fact of the matter is that if you've got a choice to talk about Benjamin Britten or Shostakovich is the composer who's made more impact around the world than Britain, even though Britain is a great composer. So I had to make some choices there, and I think that's seeing the Bowie exhibition yesterday made me think it's not always the people with the most training who end up making the biggest impact, which is not the question you asked, but I've...
But you answered that too, so that was fine. The gentleman over at the back there who was waving before, yes. I think we have time for one or two more, not too many.
First of all, thank you very much indeed for showing the wonderful story of the musicalities or history of European music, especially people like me. It was so good.
Thank you. I like those questions.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
Are you equally trained singers as well?
Am I?
Trained singer.
Am I a trained singer?
Yes.
Well, I was trained between the ages of 7 and 13, and after that I was on my own.
I see. Thank you very much. My second question is that you are a composer. If the other conductor conduct your piece without a score in front of him, how would you feel?
Well, that's very interesting. I can answer the question in a general sense, is that now, in the last few years, I've started to conduct, and I never used to conduct, and so I always had other people conducting my music. And now that I do conduct, I feel very differently about it than I did before. And I would summarize it thus. When you do a new piece, say, and it's performed, and someone else is performing and someone else is conducting, you have all the nerves and energy of the performers, but nowhere for this energy to go. It's just inside you, eating up with nerves and panic and anxiety. So for the first thing is, if you conduct, you can actually use that energy positively and constructively. The second thing is that tempo, the speed at which a piece of music goes, is for me part of the composition process. If you talk to a lot of players and interpreters and conductors who are not composers, they think tempo is a movable feast. It's a multiple choice question. I think I'll do this piece faster because it will be better. And most of the composers they're doing this to are dead and cannot complain. And I now realise that one of the reasons I've been so tense in so many premieres and pieces of mine done by other people is because it's going at the wrong speed. And it's not that it's possible, by the way, that they're right and that there is a better speed, but I don't want to be in the room feeling a different speed while they're doing it. So starting to conduct myself has been part of the solution to that problem. And I think I've spoken to my fellow composers about this, and we are as one, which is that tempo, there is one tempo. There always is one tempo for your piece. And we are, in a sense, lucky in that we now have, for the last 50 years, very accurate ways of determining tempo. But before that, whilst metronomes existed, metronomes are notoriously inaccurate and subject to too many changes of I won't go into it now, but the tempo markings that Beethoven put, which are metronome marks, it's fair enough to say they are rough, they are approximate. But it's not fair to say that about the tempo markings put by modern composers because they are very precise. And we accept that things move about a bit as they play. They get a bit faster, a bit slower, etc. But I think that it's misunderstood. In the same way that for me as a composer of my background, I think the choice of instruments is part of my job, not someone else's job. But it may surprise you to know that in the Broadway musical and in film writing, they're two different people. Composers don't do orchestrating in films, on the whole. John Williams doesn't orchestrate his own music. It's different people. And it's the same with a Broadway musical, and to some extent West End musicals, there are some exceptions. Generally speaking, they are two completely different jobs, different people. And I find this strange, because I grew up thinking the choice of the oboe playing that piece is part of the composer's job. So I still do it, much to the alarm and amazement of my colleagues in these other fields when I'm doing a musical or when I'm doing a film. They would say, well, who's going to orchestrate it? And I say, well, I am. They say, well, how are you going to fit that in? Because the time scale is so difficult. I say, well, if I don't do it, it won't sound like me. And it's true. I've had some of my pieces re-orchestrated by other people, and they've done a perfectly good job. It doesn't sound like my music anymore. So it's like someone else.
Perhaps, unfortunately. Sadly, we have to end it there. There's another event coming up. Firstly, thank you very much, Howard, for giving us such an extraordinary insight into your world. I must say you wear your Oxford First in music very lightly indeed. But I think what I've enjoyed most about the session is the feeling of being allowed into the thought processes and the mind of someone who really, really knows their stuff and is an exceptional person. I feel I've entered a world of music, and I think that's what these events can do exceptionally well. And thank you both very much for allowing us through that door into your world. I have one more thank you, which is to the sponsors of tonight's event, the very generous Nexus Group, without whom we would not have had such a wonderful experience. Could you please just stay in your seats for one moment, and I'll bring Howard and Katie through to the tent, and I'm sure there'll be lots of people who will want their books signing. Thank you again.